It's been a while. I moved like 3 times, got married, and I had a kid. Pretty sure my last BoobTube review was like 8 years ago. So it's been a hot minute. But I'm recently unemployed. Kind of. So I thought I would maybe take this time to make a couple of videos talking about my interests in horror films in particular, and I thought that the Babadook would be a great way to kind of bridge from the first 2 reviews I did and into the next set of reviews that I want to do. I'm mostly going to still treat them like video essays instead of just straight review videos, and feel free to check out my Patreon where you can actually vote on the next one that I'm going to be doing. This is kind of just like a weird little experiment, just seeing if people appreciate these videos. I'm just looking to maybe share some of my ideas and build a bit of an audience where we can chat about movies, because I just love to talk about movies, and it's been a while. In the time in between the last video and this one, I have been doing kind of on and off little comic reviews, but they're just a little bit harder to share around. People really like them, so I thought that I would kind of adapt one of my comic reviews into a video review and then kind of see where it goes from there. So I'd love to hear some feedback on whether this format works and whether this is something that people would enjoy. So thank you so much, and let's get started with the Babadook. Hey Timmy, time to go to bed. Let's read a book together first though. How about Mr. Babadook? If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook. If you're a really clever one and you know what it is to see, then you can make friends with a special one. A friend of you and me. Alright. That's enough of that. I'm just gonna go deal with this real quick. That's probably good enough. The Babadook is directed by Jennifer Kent, and it follows this grieving widow's descent into insanity as she deals with her son's behavioral needs, as well as these unresolved grief in relation to her husband's death. The way that this film is kind of framed is that it starts with the death of her husband. They get into a car crash while on the way to the hospital for her to give birth to their son. So there's a lot of unresolved grief related to this really traumatic event that happened to her, and she's definitely having trouble at this point in the film where you meet her dealing with this grief as well as building a healthy relationship with her son. There's a lot of kind of codependency, but then also a lot of distance that she gives her son in a lot of ways, and is just looking like she's not going to be able to come out of this grief in a healthy way, and she's just kind of living and simmering in this grief. What happens is that this book shows up in their house, and her son asks her to read it to her, and at first it seems like kind of creepy, kind of cute, but then it starts to be a little bit too close to home, and it just starts to become a little bit creepy, so she rightfully so decides to, burn it and destroy it. Then they become aggravated by this being called the Babadook, starting the little creepy things, and then it starts to get a lot more dramatic, leading to a really fantastic third act. This is going to delve into spoilers later on. I'm going to try to keep it a bit light, but definitely, near the end of the video, I'm going to start talking like major spoilers, because that's kind of what's important for the argument that I want to lay out today. So speaking of the argument, I kind of have three that I really want to tackle as we go through this video. So the first is that the film borrows from German Expressionism in order to create a chilling and aesthetically unique experience, and not just for the visual impact of the film, but actually also thematically it's quite important that it uses this German Expressionist aesthetic, because it actually kind of works in a really interesting way to juxtapose her feelings and then give the viewers a visual representation of how she's dealing with her grief and her descent into madness. And then number two is that the Babadook succeeds as an elevated horror film due to its clever writing and tight structure. And I will kind of delve into how elevated horror, I don't think it's completely problematic as a term, but kind of why it can act as this gatekeeping in the film criticism community. And then for the third argument that I want to make today is that horror films are uniquely suited to creating compelling stories about socio-political and interpersonal issues. So more so than, comedy and drama, horror films are they navigate issues in a really interesting way and use these kind of over-the-top exaggerated scenarios to help us deal with real life issues. So first and foremost, let's get into the German Expressionism. So I am a film nerd. I have a visual arts degree. I've looked into German Expressionism a lot. I love it as an aesthetic. One of my favorite films is The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, because it is literally just dripping with German Expressionism. For those of you who aren't aware of The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, I feel like it's mandatory in the film studies realm to know about it, but it's a silent film where the aesthetic of the film is so creepy and weird, and it gives you this sense that it's this kind of dream for everything. The set design is unreal. There's like painted on shadows, things that don't make sense, rooms that are all angled and bizarre. So it's a really, really interesting piece to look at aesthetically, but then also thematically, because the characters work in this very dreamlike fashion as well. So the characters don't move like you would in real life, especially Caesar, who's the somnambulist. So he is this sleepwalker and he moves really bizarre. He has this great body language, but he feels like he's just crawling out of the shadows of this really, really interesting design that they have for the film. So The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, I even just recommend looking at a highlight reel of it just to kind of get the feel for this film, because it does have some really compelling ways that it's telling us that what we're looking at is a dream. The characters really work into the aesthetic as well. So it's not just, people acting like normal people in this really aesthetically pleasing, very kind of surreal landscape. The characters also act like they're in a dream. They act like they belong in this really ethereal kind of strange world. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested at all in this kind of aesthetic, then to look into The Cabinet of Dr Caligari, because I think it will actually make you appreciate the Babadook even more, because it takes so many lengths to really encompass the German Expressionist aesthetic, and it's not just for visual appeal. What it does is it creates the sense of unease in the viewer for sure by using this aesthetic. The house set that they created for the Babadook is really well designed, and what I love is that if you look at the kind of behind the scenes stuff, you can see that they took a brush and just kind of painted everything so that the tones weren't even on the walls. Everything looked a little bit brushstrokey, a little bit painterly, and that's just what I love, that lovely little touch. All the walls are really gray. The house itself feels very outdated because it is a modern film, but the house itself feels very from the past, very, very outdated, very gray, very drab, kind of almost like this prison that they live in. And they just start spending more and more time in this house as the movie progresses. So you just get the sense that they're just being closed in to this really creepy, really gray, really drab place that they live in. What's really great about using this aesthetic is that it gives the viewers a visual representation of Amelia's insanity as she kind of devolves, as she deteriorates, as her life starts to fall apart, as things start to just become more surreal, as the Babadook becomes more of a presence in her house, as she becomes more of an insomniac. You can just see this visual appeal is working really well to show us what's going on in her head, how her mental status is being affected, and just how negatively this grief is kind of taking over her life. So that's what I love about this German Expressionist aesthetic, is that they use it to show us what's going on instead of telling us. You're not being beaten over the head with the backstory. They show you at the very beginning the car accident. People mention that she's grieving, and you can tell, like, you understand enough about her, but the house itself is just this reminder that she's living in this very dreary state, that she's not doing so hot. I mean, to just be totally clear about it. She's suffering, she's grieving, and this house is just further proof that she's just really, really negatively affected by the death of her husband. What I also love is that not only does it borrow the aesthetic, but it also calls back to Cabinet of Dr Caligari, in that she hallucinates at one point while watching TV, and the Babadook appears in their TV set. That was a great callback, but also a great way to show that, the Babadook is just taking over her subconscious as well. And then also what is fantastic is there is a scene where she is trying to go to bed, and they put her in this floating rig, and she descends onto her bed. And the way she moves is very much like out of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And it just is so fantastic. And again, it gives the viewer this sense of her waning sanity. She's just ethereal. She's floating into bed. She's not even human anymore. She's just kind of a husk. So it is really compelling and a really great way to use this really interesting aesthetic to tell a modern story and give the audience kind of a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and let them understand what's going on by using the aesthetic. So it just really borrows from German Expressionism, not only as this really fun aesthetic callback, but also just as a great way to tell their story. For elevated horror, it's a term used to describe horror films that use horrific elements to kind of talk more about these down-to-earth real issues that we deal with in our lives. Sometimes looking at these issues can be easier when they're presented in an escapist format. So you're just able to tackle things from real life a little bit more easily when they're presented in a film. You're given this character growth, you're given this plot that encompasses the issue, but then it also gives you this sense of closure that you don't necessarily get in real life. So horror films are really uniquely suited to talking about these issues in, a lot of ways. The scarier concept to us is what we deal with in real life. So horror films are a safe haven for us to work through these concepts without feeling like they're completely reflective of reality. Elevated horror offers a sense of catharsis and closure, perhaps even inspiring real change in our lives. I've definitely seen films and realized that, this is something that affects me, and have actually been able to grow from it. So it's really interesting that films can not only be entertaining to us, but they can affect real change in our lives, or be used even for any sort of movements, or as sort of a commentary on what we're dealing with in modern times, and maybe some changes that we need to see happen over the course of our lives. I find the classification of elevated horror a little problematic because it can sometimes belittle other horror films. It's sort of treating it like, this is acceptable, this is considered high art, and then slasher films or paranormal films are considered to be kind of lowbrow. They're bottom of the barrel. There's nothing there. So definitely I find elevated horror to be a great way to appreciate when someone has taken great lengths to tell this really compelling story dealing with human issues. But I don't like using it to the detriment of other films that maybe don't have these kind of complex issues that they bring in, or films that are meant to just entertain us, because that's okay. It's okay for a film just to be entertaining. I like the term elevated horror as long as we're using it in a positive way for the films that we're classifying as elevated horror films, but I don't necessarily like it as kind of a way to negate more just stereotypical horror films that we're used to, because I think that there is still something compelling in a lot of horror films. They don't have to talk about issues. Why would you put the pressure on every single horror film to have this kind of commentary or this insight into the human condition when we don't put this expectation onto other films? So I find elevated horror as a term itself to be fine if you're going to use it to kind of just highlight the positives. So calling The Babadook or Get Out an elevated horror film is fantastic, but I would find it detrimental to call something like Friday the 13th or Halloween a lowbrow film, or belittle the people who enjoy those films, because I love horror films. I love the stupid campy, I love the human condition ones, I love the ones that are just an absolute gore fest. I love the genre itself. I definitely do appreciate this idea of the elevation of horror, but I do think it's a bit tricky, and to make sure that we're not using it in a really negative way towards other horror films. Adding in themes based around socio-political and personal issues can push this discussion even further. So it can encourage people to talk about their real life parallels and real life trauma. I mean, everyone's talking about Get Out. It is honestly like one of my favorite films. It's so well done, so well crafted. The filmmaking, the set design, everything about it is really fantastic. But it has this also great commentary about this kind of faux wokeness in this film that not only portrays this classism in America, but also speaks to the commodification of Black people, both historically with slavery, but also with more modern exploits in television and movies. You know, thinking about blaxploitation films and ways that we use these kind of character tropes to make it look like we're being inclusive, but you still have one Black person in a sea of white people in a film. So it has this really great commentary on not only kind of the past, because these Black characters are being commodified for these suburban white people, but it's also kind of hitting really close to home in how we are engaging in this commodification as well. We are watching this film. We are, encouraging this discussion. So it's a really interesting film that has slightly too scary parallels to real life right now instead of just in the past. But again, another elevated horror film that gets us talking and can maybe even incite real change and hopefully highlight more Black filmmakers and directors so that they can then tell their own personal stories. It's a talent that he's been able to make it into a really chilling film that you can kind of watch at face value, but then you also walk away thinking, it's not so different from real life. So how does this kind of insight into the human condition work in The Babadook? So Amelia's story is relatively small in comparison to Get Out, seeing as how it speaks to a really personal issue with her grieving, and she has her own kind of personal investment in everything. She's not a blanket Mary Sue character. She's her own being with her own history. So it just feels a lot smaller than a lot of other kind of elevated horror films. But what I do find compelling about her story is that you see the damage her husband's death has caused. She's given up on relationships and hobbies, holding herself up in her dark and depressing house. You can see how this detachment has affected her loved ones. Her son has difficulty building friendships and obsesses over protecting his mother with frightening weapons and emotional outbursts. He struggles with boundaries and is increasingly needy when he notices Amelia pulling away from him. So again, as I mentioned before, they have this weird kind of codependent but also very hands-off approach together where you feel like she's trying to keep him separate from her. She's not really emotionally available to give him all the nurturing that he needs, especially with kind of his more complex behavioral issues that are showing up, where he needs a way to deal with these feelings he has, and she's not giving him that outlet. Amelia's sister has started to distance herself, calling Amelia out for not dealing with her grief, as well as suggesting that Samuel is suffering from this stagnation. He has never celebrated a birthday due to his father dying on the day he was born, so Samuel has always had a shared birthday party with his cousin. And when she decides to have her own party, she wants to have this princess party, Samuel is left feeling unloved because he hasn't offered his own birthday party to compensate for his cousin's shift in interests. But now he isn't given this opportunity to be independent and have his own party sharing his own interests. He's told he's not having a party at all at this point. And Amelia is actually quite hard on her sister about it, saying, we can't celebrate it on his birthday. But her sister is like, it's been 7 years and you have to validate your son. So it's a really interesting way to kind of see these relationships, how they've faded over time. They've gotten a little bit harder to deal with, and Amelia is just desperately holding on because she doesn't want this very, very tenuous way of dealing with it to crumble, but it is crumbling, and she's just trying her best to hold on. She just is falling apart, and everything is slowly coming out, and she's starting to have to deal with this trauma. Amelia herself is drastically falling apart, and the Babadook appears not to further deteriorate her mental state, but instead it challenges her. She needs to reclaim her life by confronting her trauma trauma. What I find interesting about this is before her ultimate confrontation, she becomes possessed by the Babadook and says the horrible thoughts that have been plaguing her since Samuel was born. Samuel is able to state that while possessed, she isn't his mother. But what I would suggest is that this version of Amelia is the most authentic she's been in over 6 years. She's talking about her trauma, however distorted her perception has become. She's sharing how brutal being a single mother has been, the guilt she has over feeling dissatisfied, as well as selfishly wishing that Samuel died instead of his dad. It's a horrific thought to have, but also understandable. She's reminded every single day of the death of her husband because her son is starting to look more and more like him. Like, how difficult would that be to deal with this grief and this trauma when you have this reminder of the person who left you so untimely and so soon, when you planned on having this child together and you thought he was going to be there to help you, and now you're alone grieving and you don't have any sort of solace to recover. You don't have a break because you have this child that needs you. I think that this is so important for Amelia's growth and healing. She let herself become lifeless and bitter by holding in these horrible feelings. By stating them out loud, she reclaims power over her life and is then able to confront Mr. Babadook himself. What is exceptional about the confrontation is that the Babadook doesn't die or leave the house. It goes down to the basement. Just like how her grief will never truly go away, neither does the Babadook. Amelia is required to make a concerted effort every day to overpower her grief and learns how to live with it. Instead of giving audiences a satisfying conclusion, Jennifer Kent instead provided a more nuanced ending, showing that Amelia is still a work in progress, much like how we all are. You don't just confront your demons and are immediately cured. It's a process, with the hope that each day gets a little bit easier. The Babadook is an insightful, expressive, and horrifying film that comments on trauma in a compelling story. Its German expressionist aesthetic works to create a dreamlike and surrealist quality that lends itself to the dark themes it presents. It delivers on emotional depth, creative visuals, and fantastic scares, and has helped introduce a new generation of movie fans to the horror genre. I really recommend checking out The Babadook. It honestly scared me real bad when I first watched it, but now I really appreciate using the horror themes to tell this really awesome and compelling story that is rewatchable, entertaining, and beautiful to look at. I just can't get over how amazingly and well crafted this film was. And I love too that it wasn't made on a tentpole budget. It was made on $2 million, and you can see every cent went towards the writing, the set design, the filmmaking, and all of the kind of ins and outs of the film. You see that a cent isn't wasted, that they really put their all into making this really lovely and amazing film. And then they also made a fantastic book as well that I very much appreciate as a horror fan. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if this is something that you would like to see more of in the future. And I will be back hopefully with The Faculty, doing a comparison to The Thing and talking about baby Elijah Wood fighting aliens, I guess. Thank you so much. Check out all of my social links down there. Thank you to Tara Lazo Sound for doing the sound design for my skit in this video, and be sure to check out their work as well. They have sound libraries coming out very soon. Thank you. Bye. Yeah. Just watch me fix my hair. The Babadook is this magnificent... And yes, I spent $120 on the official Babadook book from the creators of the film. So, you know, if I could get that Venmo'd back, that'd be great. Totally just kidding. I bought it like 5 years ago just because I'm a total nerd, and I was going to make a video 5 years ago about it, and at this point it's just like I've eaten the cost, so really I'm just joking. But yeah, feel free to like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'd love to hear some feedback on whether this format is appreciated.